Hello, everyone.
Hello, Evelina. Hello, anyone tuning in.
Welcome to our Wellbeing Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy. So, for those who are tuning in for first time, these are our weekly live conversations from well-being industry, where we're discussing a variety of topics that often stay behind the closed doors. And today's topic is about menopause. And today we really want to dig in deeper into what are real costs of menopause in terms of work and business costs, but also what are the costs on individuals, on our quality of lives, on our levels of productivity. So I know that there's so much talk currently about menopause, and there is a lot of I think the stigma and taboo around menopause is really diminishing. And I'm really, really glad to hear that there are more conversations. But there are also a lot of risks associated with that, because as everyone starts talking about it, it becomes very difficult to kind of discern what's right and what's real from some myths. And especially on social media, some people kind of sharing their personal experiences. There are a lot of quite scary information out there about menopause, right? So yeah, Valentina, what are your thoughts on that? And let's look at what is it that we can dive into today to look at what really is menopause, what are the costs of that on individuals who are going through the process, but also their loved ones. What is the cost of menopause to the business? And also dive into nitty gritty of symptoms, what we can do about it, what support is missing for people, and what is it that's available for us to help tackle that.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to kind of get into all of that because, as you say, I do think it's quite a current topic at the moment. It's becoming more open and less taboo. And kind of, as we mentioned, different experiences of menopause. And you say this, like, it can be quite scary. There's a lot of information out there, people sharing experiences on social media. I think it's so important to highlight that, like with anything that goes on in your body, your hormones, even your brain, it's unique to you. So every individual will experience menopause a bit differently depending on their hormonal balances or imbalances, depending on their body composition, their genetic factors, their lifestyle. So many things can influence that. And some of those, like genetics, even though with epigenetics, sometimes we can influence our genetics, but some of those are harder to influence and some are easier to influence. And so we'll go into that a little bit today as well. There's also loads of resources that we
Yeah.
have linked to afterwards.
So before we dive in, actually, Valentina, can I ask you? So what is it that personally, about menopause, and obviously we are still a little bit younger, not approaching that age yet. But I'd be very curious to know, what is your kind of relationship, I would say, with menopause, right? Like, is that something that, your mom talked to you about when you were small? Is that something that your friends discuss with you? How prepared do you feel to go into that menopause eventually, right? So I'd be curious to kind of see, what's your personal take and
Yeah.
relationship with that.
Thank you for asking. I think that's a really nice way to open this up as well. And I'd love to hear your answers to that too. But so for me, menopause, my mom was very open. And I think that really helped. And not just open about what she was experiencing and the fact that she was going through menopause, but actually what she was doing to support her hormonal health as well. I know that she used natural progesterone cream to help balance her hormones. She said she found that really, really useful. So I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind as something that might work for me when I come to that stage. But I also kind of always thought of it as essentially like a second puberty. It's like you've got your puberty on the way into fertility and you've got your puberty on the way out of fertility. And it feels like that. So I've kind of mentally, I'm bracing myself for those kinds of feelings and experiences. But hopefully at this point in my life, or when I get to that point in my life, with a lot more self-awareness about my own emotional state, so how I experience it mentally, but also about my physical body, what works for me, what doesn't work for me. There's also something, hormonal health is something that I'm very interested in anyway. I have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I've actually been able to almost reverse with lifestyle factors. So that gives me
That's amazing. That probably deserves a separate topic on its own, right?
Yeah,
Because obviously so
that.
many women struggle with a lot of those kind of hormonal health issues. And yeah, it's very difficult to access right support. And even with things like menopause, it is still very difficult to access help, because even GPs do not always receive that training, right? It's part of their CPD. If somebody wants to upgrade their skill set and decide to add a little bit more about menopause or about, you know, mental health, actually this is not part, neither of those things is part of your core training. So it's not easy to find the right support and know what is the right thing to do. And the moment we start Googling on the web, then there is so much noise and chaos that you don't really know how to kind of separate the myths from their reality.
Absolutely. And there can be a lot of fear mongering around those sorts of symptoms. Hormonal symptoms, I think, can be particularly scary, because a lot of the time they can, you know, they affect the whole body. There's stories of people's hair falling out, brittle bones, gaining a lot of weight, all of these things. And, you know, without going into loads of detail, I really want to reassure anyone listening to this that those things are actually you can influence all of that with your lifestyle and making certain changes. But yeah, in workplaces in particular, we're saying GPs who are health practitioners often don't know a huge amount about menopause. Well, thinking about the workplace, I mean, that's as another step removed. And a lot of the time people people who are managing people don't know a lot about menopause and might not know how to support someone experiencing perimenopause or menopausal symptoms.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning, right? So what even is menopause, right? And I know this might be very obvious for some, but also there are all of these other terms like perimenopause and postmenopause. So when exactly is that? So menopause is the time after your periods have completely stopped. And because towards the end of those cycles, they are very irregular, we only know that they have fully stopped when we had no period for 12 months. So menopause, if you want to put specific time frame on that, is 12 months after you had your last period. And once from that moment, you can say that I am menopausal. Now, perimenopause is the time from when you experience your very first symptoms until that menopause line, right?
Of end of the period. Yeah.
And now symptoms can actually still carry on after that, because there are still a lot of changes and hormonal adaptations in our body. And an average, the average age where menopause happens, it's 51. So it's usually like a fluctuations. The average is between like 45 to 55. That is considered kind of like the normal common bandwidth. But there are some people who will experience it much earlier. So the average for UK white women, it's 51. However, women who are Black and women who are of Asian background, they usually experience menopause much earlier. And therefore, that also means that in UK, they often struggle to receive the right support, because they're just being dismissing, oh, you wait too early to be experiencing any perimenopausal symptoms. So at the moment, there are around 13 million people who are currently in either those stages. So who are currently peri or menopausal in the UK. And most people who are perimenopausal are at work. 45% of those women say that those perimenopausal symptoms have negative impact on their ability to do the job. And many have to take some time off work or even have to leave their jobs because simply they are not receiving the right support at work. So it's It's a huge statistic, because I think from demographic point of view, when we look at kind of our demographics of our workforce, that age demographic is the fastest growing population of work, right? Women of perimenopausal age. If you think, even like 10, 20 years ago, a lot of women on that age wouldn't be working. Now, most of them are working. And the fact that we are now all at work and experiencing those symptoms, it has a huge, huge impact on our ability to perform, to do the job in the right way, but also to receive the right support, and to have that balance between our work and personal life. So yeah, it's also that nearly half of women who have to take some time off for to cope with some of their perimenopausal symptoms, they don't tell the reasons why they're taking the time off. They don't share that with their managers, which I think is a real kind of representation of how open we are to be talking about this in the workplaces, because we do talk about it, but if we are not prepared to share and be honest about this, that's still a long way to go.
It's true. And I think that it can, it's really important to create a space where people feel safe and comfortable talking about hormonal symptoms generally, but in particular menopause, as we're talking about today, when communicating with their employer about, say, time off or experiencing symptoms like brain fog that can interfere with work. It's so important that an employer creates a safe space to allow someone to say those kinds of things, because not only does that mean that those symptoms and those experiences can be managed better so that that person can be as productive as they can be. It might be about reorganizing some of their tasks, having more flexibility with their workload or their location of work. Also, it could be about getting the right kind of maybe mental health support for them through their workplace when they're experiencing symptoms that, are emotional symptoms. And so understanding that in context can also help give context to somebody's behavior. So if you are noticing as an employer that maybe someone's relationships at work are changing because they're experiencing different emotions, they might become more sensitive. They might become more kind of creative or energetic at times, but more tired and brain foggy at other times. It's really important to have an atmosphere where that can be reflected back in a caring way, so that it allows the person who's experiencing those symptoms to then share.
Absolutely. And here I found some statistic here that says it's 75% of perimenopausal women are at work. So obviously this is a huge proportion. And also, this is not something that affects women only. It has impact on their partners, on their colleagues, on their managers, on family members, right? So there are all of these aspects that really affect everyone at work, right? So this is not just about those women who are going through this challenging time in their life. And when we look at symptoms as well, I think as women, even ourselves, we don't know that. We don't know that until we start experiencing that. And then we start speaking with our colleagues, our friends who are of the same age. And then we are kind of start to Google and learn and so on. But the moment when that is already happening, now that is too late. And there are so many stories of women starting to experience some symptoms, and it can be really scary if you don't understand what is it. So let's do a bit of myth busting, and let's look into some of those symptoms. So we can divide them into, let's say, psychological and physical, right? So I think we are much more aware of physical symptoms. So things like hot flushes, it's the biggest one. But then we also have less known ones. So things like headaches, tiredness and fatigue, achy muscles and joints, have heart palpitations, we have dry and itchy skin. We can have insomnia, difficulty sleeping or staying asleep, weight gain. So it becomes very, very easy to put on weight while even eating less. So again, hormones have a huge impact on our metabolism, of how we metabolize energy from food, and as our hormones shift, that affects our weight as well. We also have a lot of other things that people are not talking about, right? So there are things like weakening of pelvic floor muscles and bladder, urinary issues. We have loss of libido, changes in physical experience of orgasm. You have very heavy periods, so-called flooding, and it's just, random, irregular, heavy bleeding. Also, things like vaginal dryness and pain during intercourse. So those are obviously things that are not comfortable to discuss. And even though we talk about, menopause at work, we often don't address them to this detail, right? We talk about, oh, there's hot flushes and I'm struggling to concentrate, right? But there are all these other things that actually really affect people's intimate lives, people experience with their own body and their own relationships, right?
And I think it's important to kind of think about that in the wider context of the human experience. If you're experiencing differences in your intimate relationships at home, that's quite a fundamental relationship or relationships, and that can destabilize you. And feel you can get kind of difficulty with your identity as well, identifying as somebody who is menopausal, perimenopausal, or postmenopausal, and also what these changes in kind of your relationship to your partners, your kind of sexuality and your sense of identity, like that really plays into your sense of who you are. And it's like, I made this comparison with puberty earlier, and I really do feel that kind of carries across, because
it's a lot of change.
It's a lot of change, and it's a lot of adjusting your sense of identity to these physical and emotional changes that are happening in your body. And that, I don't think, can kind of be underestimated. We look at each of these individual symptoms, but the experience also of going through these ones, especially those that aren't talked about that much, because it can feel quite isolating and be quite a personal struggle to then shift your sense of identity around these symptoms.
Yeah, which I think brings another very important point, which is a link between menopause and mental health. And here, when we look at psychological symptoms of perimenopause, you have anxiety, we have low mood and depression, we have memory issues and brain fog. So, it's very difficult to sometimes maintain our daily performance and even maintain the same level of conversations if you cannot recall specific words. Again, difficulties with sleep, but also there is one big one, and that is loss in confidence. And some of those things can be affected by a lot of other things happening in your life. Like, you're afraid that, oh, maybe I have brain fog. I'm not able to do my job properly. I'm not able to have the same conversations. But actually, there is a biological side of this in relation to hormones and in relation to our levels of, even like cortisol and testosterone and like all of these other aspects that are shifting very quickly, which actually creates the physical sense of drop in confidence. And you think like, oh, something's wrong with me. I was this confident person, and now suddenly I'm really struggling to put myself out there. And sometimes are these much more earlier symptoms before any other more obvious symptoms like hot flushes start appearing, right? So those psychological symptoms usually come first. So we have, mood fluctuations, we have anxiety issues, we have memory issues, we have loss in confidence. And those are very often being dismissed as, oh, again, this is just like this time of the month. And a lot of women are not receiving right help because of this. Now there's another quite shocking statistic that I find, that 42% of women who approach GPs with some of these perimenopausal symptoms are actually being prescribed antidepressants instead of actually receiving, let's say, HRT, which is hormonal replacement therapy. And that, again, it goes back to kind of inadequacy of our health system and lack of training of GPs that they have, where they are constantly dismissing some of those signs, and they are not able to attribute the symptoms to the real underlying causes to find the right solution. So just something for you as well to be aware of. I think we really need to educate ourselves much better in that and really take ownership of that and proactively choose, who do we want to see as doctors, and where do we find that support.
Absolutely. And I think kind of you mentioned something earlier about, once it's happening, sometimes it can feel like it's too late, or you're sort of running to catch up. And if you're going to a doctor and you're saying your symptoms of anxiety or low confidence or mood fluctuations, and you end up being prescribed antidepressants, there's a lot of work to then be done to go back from that. Coming off antidepressants can be really, really difficult. So when they're prescribed kind of unnecessarily, or it's not the right prescription, when something like HRT or some kind of even some CBT to start understanding and creating a bit of distance between your emotions can be really useful. So I would really encourage kind of anyone listening to this. I'm not just talking about women, and I'm not just talking about women who might be approaching perimenopausal age, but men as well, to notice in your family members, friends, partners, share that kind of information, do the research. You wouldn't want to see people that you care about going through this difficult experience and then having kind of not the right information and not the right support from their health practitioners. And so being able to go, with your own information to a GP and say, I'm experiencing these symptoms. I think that it's probably, or it could be perimenopause. That immediately, at least, it brings it into the conversation, and it cuts down that time between saying your symptoms and then getting the right treatment.
Absolutely. And I think taking ownership of our own journey is definitely something that we need to do. And of course, now there's other big aspect, when we kind of download this huge list of negative symptoms, no wonder people are scared of this. No wonder there's so much negativity around this, because it looks like menopause is this, scary time where, everything goes wrong, right? Physically, psychologically, in our relationships, in our intimate lives, right? It's just like, oh my God, everything is bad. But actually, that's not the case. So when we look at kind of the experience of those symptoms, half of the population of women actually experiencing quite mild to medium symptoms, and they're not experiencing all of them at the same time either, right? So maybe it starts with a bit of anxiety and brain fog, and then that clears up, and then maybe you have something else for few months or few years, and it kind of changes and it evolves. So it's not as overwhelming as, when we read all the list of symptoms, you don't ever experience them all at the same time, right? They come and go, there are changes. And when we look at symptoms, I think it's equally important to highlight some positive symptoms of menopause. And this is not something that I've ever seen highlighted anywhere, right? We are just seeing these, negative things. So, when we ask whether, changes that are happening in their life are positive or negative, nearly 60% of women say that actually some changes were positive, right? There are some aspects that they say that, it brought them closer to their partners. Maybe, they were able to talk about things they were not able to do before. One thing that all the women also report is boost of creativity, right? So you have, this freedom to innovate, to reinvent yourself. And I really like that in Eastern cultures, the menopause is actually referred to as second spring. And I really like that, because it's so much more positive and so much more kind of rejuvenating experience, where, kind of more in our cultures, we see it as more of a, oh, that's, the beginning of the end, right, of you being a woman. So
Yeah.
I really, really like, the language that we use around this can really, really make a difference. And the language, shapes the cultural attachments and the cultural beliefs and values around this. So some of the more positive symptoms include energy and motivation. I mentioned creativity. There's also kind of increased sensitivity to the environment, and this can be positive as well as negative. It can be a little bit overwhelming, but it can also mean that we are just so much more in touch and in tune with ourselves, with our bodies, with our physical environment, with other people around it. And we can really use this for our, growth and personal development and spirituality in a way, right? It can really enhance that aspect of our lives. There's also a renewed sense of purpose and grounding. So as we go through that change cognitively, there's a lot of things that are happening that are kind of, lead you to questioning, like, where am I and where am I going? And it leads to this sense of grounding and renewed purpose. You also need less sleep to have the same quality of rest. So, as our hormones shift, it affects our circadian rhythm. And actually, we end up sleeping a little bit less, and we still have the same quality of rejuvenation and rest. Also, we have no more spots and breakouts, so we have much clearer skin. So I think that's win-win, a big win for women who sometimes have monthly breakouts before the cycles and so on. But also you have less oily hair, no need to wash your hair so often. So there are a lot of little things as well that can be positive. And I think it's so important to highlight those as well, because otherwise, we talk about menopause as this very scary, hairy thing that, everything goes wrong. So it's really, really important to highlight that it's nothing to be afraid of. It is a change. It, some aspects of it can be for better, some of it can be for worse, but the difference between that, it's how we manage it, how we approach it, how prepared we are to go through that change.
Absolutely. And I think, another kind of positive one there for a lot of people, I think it's worth mentioning, is that a lot of people who struggle with really difficult, heavy periods, and that can be that the cycle of hormones for some women and can be really, really disruptive to everyday life. And it takes a lot of learning and management to kind of go through that roller coaster every month of your clarity of thought and your sensitivity, or like the physical pain involved, the lethargy and versus the activity. Going through that kind of cycle of changes can be quite difficult, especially when our world around us isn't really very well adapted to it. And so actually having a more consistent experience, I'm talking now about post-menopause, having a more consistent experience of those things can be somewhat of a relief. Well, of course, there's, there might be a feeling of missing your periods, missing your cycle and that kind of relationship with your body. But also the silver lining is that there's perhaps less to manage in terms of monthly fluctuations.
Yeah, and a lot of women are very happy when their periods stop, right? It's a huge burden and pain and all sorts of things, right? That I'm personally very, very lucky. I'm not really struggling with it, but I know that a lot of women do, and therefore it can be a huge relief when you just don't have to put up with it anymore.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So let's look at that. We looked at kind of individual impact of menopause on each person and all of these kind of different symptoms and positive and negative side effects. Let's look at what are the costs of menopause to the business. So I think what's important to realize is that if we're looking at 80% of menopausal women are at work, it will have a huge impact on our levels of performance and relationships and so on, because if we are not being our best selves, of course we will bring that to work. Now there's a huge myth that women who are going through that change, they don't want to work and they just want time off. It's actually not true. And when we think about this, that age, if you think, okay, even like 45 to 55 as the average, right? Sometimes it's early and late and so on. This is your prime time from career perspective, right? Your children are probably more or less independent, right? You don't need to be changing nappies and babysitting. You have this freedom and you have expertise. You have 20, 30 years of experience under your belt, and this is really prime time to contribute and to invest back in your own development, in your own contribution, in your own performance. And usually women at that age, they are, yeah, in so many ways in their prime from the experience point of view, right? And yet, if we fail to support them, of course, we are losing now our best experts, people who are really keen to contribute to the company, because now, I think there's also, I know, Valentina, you mentioned identity, right? So I think if your identity is a woman, and if your identity is a mother, and what happens to that identity when, let's say, your children grow up and leave home, right? Your sense of motherhood changes because now you're not needed for your children as much, right? Which actually leaves a bit of a void in. So if I'm not being a mother, if my children don't need me anymore, if I'm not raising them, where else can I apply myself? Where else can I contribute to? And usually that time, it's exactly where there is that renewed purpose and sense of motivation. And women really devote themselves to their work and to their careers, and they can perform to their best potential, which of course, then it's contradicted by some of their physical symptoms who prevent them from doing that best work. So really, if we are not supporting women at work, we are really having this huge impact on entire business performance and the culture and the productivity and even that purpose and sense of direction that we have within our teams, right?
Absolutely. And, we can't underestimate the impact of this and on the workforce and on productivity and actually the difference that good support could make. Like you say, this is where the kind of point in a woman's life when they'd be possibly able to offer the most and at the business because of their experience and because of their kind of their experience, while still also being able to be quite adaptable and learn new skills. And the kind of support that can be offered, it doesn't need to be really complex. I think there can be a fear around it, like businesses have to become an expert about menopause. Often it's actually just about listening and responding to what somebody needs and learning some basics around where to then support someone to get the right kind of care and treatment, and also where to get the right information. I'm seeing more and more companies these days hosting talks and speakers about menopause and about hormonal health, so that employees can drop in and receive that education as and when. And I think that that's a really useful support to give, because not only is it kind of bringing that information into the business, but it's educating the population. And I would also suggest that this is, most of the time these talks and these education workshops and sessions are optional. They're kind of seen as like free perks. I would put some of this into mandatory training for some people. So if you're managing people, or if you work in HR, or you have anything to do with kind of the employee experience, I think training around hormonal health and menopause is essential. I would argue that if it was something that men were going through, kind of, I mean, obviously men have hormones and their own hormonal health. But if kind of men were going through, it would be built into the system.
Yeah. So I actually have some results of a survey that's been completed by British Menopause Society, and they actually looked at what people want from their employers. And the list is really, it's quite comprehensive, but also very simple. So there are things like access to experts and information, right? So we know that, there is overwhelm of advice and it's not filtered in any way and you don't know what to trust. So again, having this kind of expert guidance and information that you can trust and educate yourself in advance is really, really valuable. So it's number one thing, just access to experts and information. There's some other things like support with medication. So things like with hormonal replacement therapy, it can be a bit of a hit and miss with access to it. Once everyone started talking about it and there were some like national campaigns about it, it actually resulted in shortage of HRTs. And also knowing that there are different types of hormonal replacement therapy. So again, you have things like creams that you can apply on your legs, like estrogen creams, but you also have tablets. You have like different form of things that exist, and not having access to it or not being able to afford that will have, of course, huge effect on people's performance. So making sure that this is maybe covered as part of the private health insurance, or finding some sort of allowance to cover medication. Also, there are things like access to natural uniforms. So imagine if you are experiencing hot flushes and sweating and so on, and you have to work in some, clingy synthetic uniform, that really does not support your well-being in any way. So for those people who are working in uniforms, having that freedom and understanding that, we need to invest in good quality natural material uniforms. And again, understanding no exclusion, no discrimination from their line managers, support to be able to do the job effectively, right? So now they are asking for help to be able to do the job. It's not like, oh, help me cope with some of my private life stuff. It's really like, I want to do my job and I just need a little bit of help. And sometimes it might be just little reminders, maybe a little recap, maybe, whatever that may be, really having that support in a way that is tailored for each person and in a way that it's not labeled, right? So there's no need to raise a hand and say, oh, before this meeting, can you give me people's names because I'm menopausal and I might forget, right? There's no need to kind of like label and claim that in a way that might be kind of derogatory to our own experience or other people's experience, but just saying like, yeah, let's remind this, or let's do this and let's do that, and have very simple tailored support wherever it takes that person for that person to do their job. Also things like free sanitary products. So as we know, like one of these biggest symptoms, it's flooding and unexpected irregular periods, which means you cannot plan for it anymore. You are not prepared for this. This can happen any moment when you enter that stage of your life. So having those sanitary products available can be a huge help and save a lot of stress in those situations, as you can imagine, and also provide safe spaces to talk about it. So what is also very important to realize that some cultures don't even have the word for it, which shows example how different countries, different cultures are really approaching the subject as taboo, as this is something that shouldn't be even named, right? So it's important to realize that a lot of people from those countries will not even have a language to express their own needs and their own feelings unless we place them in that safe environment where other people can discuss this openly, so they can kind of like acquire that confidence and skills and the language to describe their own experience. And we just take that for granted. We think that, oh, because my mom talked to me about this, then that means, it's the same for everybody else. But it's not the case, right? There are cultures where, moms do not even tell their daughters about periods, right? And they're being shamed when they start bleeding and so on. So how scary is that, not to be able to talk about something like this? So absolutely, what businesses can do, it's educate women in advance before it happens. Valentina also mentioned compulsory line managers training. Again, this is something that affects everyone, not just those women who are going through that. So really being able to be comfortable around it and know how to have those conversations. It's support for those managers themselves as well. Having online resources, there are some apps, like Pepi, for example, Also, there's a lot of menopause support through private health insurance that can be added as an add-on. Usually, it's not always included into the main offer. Normalizing conversation about it, personalized support without needing to kind of label that this support is needed for me because of menopause. It's just individual personal support that I need. And I think also when we talk about the language of how we frame it, instead of just labeling it all the time, we can really make it part of this kind of wider conversations around hormonal and sexual health, which is so much more inclusive, right? Now, this is not ages, this is not, gender divisive in any way, right? It's really looking as part of this wider umbrella of hormonal and sexual health and menopause support. It's part of that, but it can be included in these wider conversations. Anything else, Valentina, that you can think of that is important and that businesses can do to support?
I think also, on top of everything that's been said already, really listening. So naturally, new research will come out. There'll be kind of more information. We'll hopefully continue learning as a society about this and how we can adapt. So just kind of trying to stay up to date and not thinking, okay, we've booked in this training or this workshop and we have a policy now about menopause and how to support people, and therefore the job is done. It's like any kind of employee support, any kind of business development, any kind of well-being, that it's always changing and growing, we're always learning. And so not kind of seeing it as a tick box exercise, really responding to what's happening in society as well as in the business.
Yeah, and I think maybe what would be important to highlight before we kind of wrap this up is the role of men in all of this. And I think also knowing that everyone is affected by this, it's like, yeah, maybe as a man, you don't go through that yourself, but you'll have your partner who does, right? You'll have your colleagues who do, you have, your daughters, your mothers, whoever, right? That you're always in touch with that experience. And I actually had a conversation once with someone who reached out for help. And he said something along the lines of, I can't get along with my wife anymore. I don't understand what's happening. There's nothing I can do or say is right. She's always on the edge. She doesn't want me anymore. There's something I'm doing wrong. She's not attracted to me. And there is all of this guilt that person felt like I'm doing something wrong. There's something wrong because my wife is not connected with me in the same way. She's always on the edge. She's always snapping at me. She has this anger outburst. She doesn't want to have sex with me, right? And they taking it personally because they have not been given that information that actually your wife is just going through menopause and there is a little bit of support and kindness that we need. And once we facilitate those conversations, then it's amazing that it can really bring people together because you realize like, oh, I don't have to go through this on my own, right? There is that support that is needed. But also there is other aspect there that there are trans men who do not live as women anymore, and yet they will still go through menopause. And for them, it's also incredibly difficult time because now suddenly you have this unwelcome reminder of your past identity that you still have to go through, right? And we often take that for granted as well. So it's very important to be really inclusive and I think if we really talk about this as part of the wider hormonal sexual health, then we can include everyone in those conversations. We include men, we include, trans people, we can include, variety of, genders, different types of relationships. And again, we look at things like fertility, right? And what does it mean, if somebody's going through menopause and they were still hoping to have children, right? And now they enter this early perimenopause, and now suddenly that hope is taken away from them. What does that mean for them, right? So I think really, really we need to look at this beyond just, this is just menopause and all of these symptoms that we need to treat. We really need to look at the wider impact on our identity, on our relationships, and on our performance at work. And how can we develop those supportive ecosystems to help each other through this and become stronger and better, because we are at that time in our life when we can really use this to our advantage and become more connected in our relationships, become more purposeful and meaningful and in our work, and really use that to our advantage rather than something that is a barrier or a limitation.
Absolutely. I think you've kind of rounded that up really nicely, and just highlighting that these shifts that we experience can be catalysts for a lot of learning and a lot of new perspectives. And often it can take a big shift like this in an individual to even get new perspectives on business, relationships, various kind of processes that we're going through as well.
Absolutely. So I think that's probably it. I know people who are watching this will probably have some questions, and not everyone feels comfortable asking those questions publicly in a chat. So we always encourage just engage in a conversation in a chat. But in this case as well, we are more than open to receive private messages. If people want a bit of direction, a bit of support and help, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions that you don't feel that you're able to ask publicly. And yeah, thank you, Valentina. And we will see you all next week, same time, same place.
Lovely. Thank you.
Evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.